The fine china shattered against the wooden floor like Eliza's world. Irreparable, scattered, destroyed. Her father's face twisted with rage as his eyes fell to her swollen belly beneath the emerald silk dress that had once made her feel beautiful. "Get out of my sight," Samuel Morrison's voice cut through the morning air like a whip crack. "You're no daughter of mine." The servants stopped their work, frozen in horrified silence as the wealthiest man in Dust Rock County stripped away everything his pregnant daughter had ever known. In 30 seconds, Eliza Morrison went from beloved heiress to discarded shame, but she had no idea that her salvation was already riding toward town, shirtless under the desert sun, with calloused hands and a heart that refused to look away from injustice. 3 months earlier, Eliza Morrison had been the pride of Dust Rock County. At 22, she commanded attention wherever her green silk dresses swept through the dusty streets. Men tipped their hats, women envied her fine clothes, and children scattered coins when her father's carriage passed. She was untouchable, protected by Samuel Morrison's vast ranch empire and seemingly endless wealth. But secrets have a way of revealing themselves. The morning sickness had started in July. By August, her corset wouldn't lace properly. By September, even her loosest dress couldn't hide what was growing beneath. Eliza had prayed for a miracle, for time to figure out what to do, but time was a luxury she didn't possess. The confrontation came on a Tuesday. Samuel Morrison stood in his grand parlor, morning coffee growing cold in his hands as Eliza faced him with trembling lips and tear-stained cheeks. The truth hung between them like smoke from a dying fire, thick, choking, inescapable. "How far along?" His voice was deadly quiet. "5 months, Papa." The coffee cup hit the floor. Hot liquid splashed across his polished boots, but Samuel didn't flinch. His weathered face, carved by years of prairie wind and cattle drives, hardened into something Eliza had never seen before. Something terrifying. "Who's the father?" Eliza's silence was answer enough. The traveling merchant who'd sweet-talked his way into her heart had vanished like morning mist, leaving nothing behind but broken promises and the life growing inside her. "My daughter," Samuel's voice rose with each word, "the daughter I raised to be respectable, to marry well, to continue the Morrison name with honor, has made herself into nothing more than a common whore." The word hit Eliza like a physical blow. She stumbled backward, her hand instinctively protecting her belly. "Papa, please. Don't you, Papa to me." Samuel's fist crashed against the mantelpiece. "You've disgraced this family. Disgraced the Morrison name that I've spent 30 years building in this territory." What happened next would haunt Eliza's dreams for months to come. Samuel Morrison called every servant in the house to witness his daughter's fall from grace. Maria, the cook who'd snuck Eliza extra desserts as a child. Tom, the stable boy who'd taught her to ride. Mrs. Henderson, the housekeeper who'd sewn all her beautiful dresses. They gathered in the parlor like mourners at a funeral, their eyes wide with shock and something else, relief that they weren't the ones facing Samuel Morrison's wrath. "This woman," Samuel gestured at Eliza as if she were a stranger, "is no longer my daughter. She will live in the servants' quarters behind the main house. She will eat what scraps are left after the real workers have finished. She will wear the clothes of her station, nothing more than rough work dresses befitting her new position as the lowest member of this household." Eliza's beautiful green silk was stripped away that very hour. In its place, she was given a simple brown work dress that hung loose on her frame, and later, as her pregnancy advanced, a faded green cotton dress that had belonged to a servant girl who'd left the year before. The transformation was swift and merciless. Her feather bed was replaced with a thin cot in a room barely larger than a closet. Her silver hairbrush, her jewelry, her books, everything that had made her who she was, vanished as if it had never existed. But the cruelest punishment was the silence. The townspeople who had once competed for her attention now crossed the street to avoid her. Former friends whispered behind fans and gloved hands. The preacher mentioned fallen women in his Sunday sermons, his eyes finding Eliza in the back pew where she sat alone, swollen with shame and the child that had cost her everything. By winter, Eliza Morrison had learned what it meant to be invisible. She hauled water, scrubbed floors, and endured the pitying glances of servants who now outranked her in the household hierarchy. Her hands, once soft and pale, grew rough and cracked. Her spirit, once bright as her favorite green silk, dimmed to something barely flickering. Samuel had achieved his goal. His daughter was broken, humbled, a living example of what happened to Morrison women who forgot their place. But Samuel Morrison had made one crucial mistake in his cruel calculation. He assumed that a broken spirit couldn't be mended, that shame was permanent, and that his daughter would never again find someone willing to see her worth. He was wrong. And his mistake was about to ride into town on a dusty horse, with muscles carved by honest work and a moral compass that pointed true north regardless of what society demanded. Winter in Dust Rock County was unforgiving, but not as harsh as the isolation that had become Eliza's daily companion. 6 months pregnant now, she moved through her days like a ghost haunting her own life. The servants avoided her not out of cruelty, but out of fear. Samuel Morrison's rage was legendary, and no one wanted to risk their livelihood by showing kindness to his disgraced daughter. Eliza had learned to time her chores around the household's rhythm. She scrubbed floors before dawn, when no one would see her struggling to her knees with her swollen belly. She hauled water during the afternoon siesta, when the other servants rested and she could avoid their uncomfortable glances. She ate alone after everyone else had finished, picking at whatever scraps remained. The worst part wasn't the physical hardship, though carrying heavy buckets while pregnant in the winter cold was exhausting. The worst part was the voice in her head that had begun to sound suspiciously like her father's. Worthless. Shameful. Deserving of this treatment. Some days Eliza almost believed it. On a particularly bitter February morning, she was struggling with 2 heavy water buckets from the well when the horse appeared on the horizon. The rider sat tall in the saddle, his broad shoulders silhouetted against the pale winter sky. Even from a distance, there was something about his posture that commanded attention, confident without arrogance, strong without swagger. The servants began to whisper. New ranch hands were rare in winter, most drifted south seeking warmer work. But this man rode straight toward the Morrison ranch as if he had business there. Jake Sullivan dismounted near the main house, and Eliza got her first clear look at him. He was perhaps 30, with the kind of build that came from years of hard labor, broad chest, muscled arms, hands that looked capable of handling both horses and trouble. His shirt was already rolled up despite the cold, revealing forearms corded with strength. But it was his eyes that caught Eliza off guard as she struggled past with her burden. Instead of sliding away like everyone else's had learned to do, they met hers directly. There was no judgment there, no disgust or pity, just a straightforward acknowledgement of her humanity that she hadn't experienced in months. "Ma'am," he said, tipping his hat, "those buckets look mighty heavy for someone in your condition." The words hit Eliza like a physical shock. No one had spoken directly to her in weeks, certainly not with such simple courtesy. She almost dropped the buckets from surprise. I can manage," she stammered, though her arms were already aching. "I'm sure you can," Jake said, and there was no condescension in his voice, just matter-of-fact kindness. "But you shouldn't have to." Before she could protest, he had taken both buckets from her hands. The relief was immediate, not just physical, but something deeper. For the first time in months, someone had treated her as if she mattered. "Where do these need to go?" Eliza found her voice long enough to give directions to the kitchen. Jake walked beside her, carrying the water as if it weighed nothing, making easy conversation about the weather and his journey from Colorado. He didn't ask about her situation, didn't stare at her belly or her rough work dress. He simply talked to her like a person. At the kitchen door, he set down the buckets and tipped his hat again. "Jake Sullivan," he said. "I'll be working here if your father decides to hire me." "Eliza," she whispered, then immediately regretted giving her name. What if he mentioned meeting her to Samuel? But Jake just nodded as if she'd given him something precious. "Pleasure to meet you, Miss Eliza." She wanted to correct him. She wasn't Miss anything anymore, just the fallen woman in servants' quarters, but the words stuck in her throat. It had been so long since anyone had addressed her with even basic respect. Jake was hired that afternoon. Samuel needed experienced hands for the spring calving season, and Jake's recommendations were solid. He was given a bunk in the ranch hand's quarters and assigned to the most demanding jobs, exactly the kind of hard labor that had built his impressive physique. Over the following days, Eliza found herself stealing glances at the new hand. He worked without his shirt in the afternoon sun, his muscles moving with practiced efficiency as he repaired fences and trained horses. But what fascinated her more than his physical strength was his character. When old Pete, the most senior ranch hand, injured his back, Jake took on extra duties without complaint. When Maria the cook struggled with heavy pots, he appeared to help before she had to ask. He treated everyone, from Samuel Morrison down to the lowest stable boy, with the same straightforward respect. Everyone except Eliza, whom he treated like a lady. It was a small thing, perhaps, but in her world of shame and isolation, Jake's simple courtesy felt revolutionary. When he passed her carrying laundry, he nodded politely. When she struggled with heavy tasks, he appeared to help without making her feel weak or pitted. But it was the way he looked at her that began to change everything. In Jake Sullivan's eyes, Eliza Morrison wasn't a fallen woman or a shameful burden. She was simply a person deserving of basic human dignity. For the first time in months, Eliza began to remember who she had been before shame consumed her identity. And as winter slowly gave way to spring, she found herself wondering if it might be possible to become someone new, someone stronger, perhaps, than she had ever been before. But such thoughts were dangerous in Samuel Morrison's house, and Eliza had already learned the price of defying her father's will. What she didn't yet know was that Jake Sullivan had never been the kind of man to back down from a fight, especially when the stakes were someone's fundamental worth as a human being. The collision between Jake's principles and Samuel's cruelty was inevitable. The only question was when the explosion would come, and what would be left standing afterward. Spring came early to Dust Rock County that year, and with it, a subtle shift in the dynamics of the Morrison Ranch. Jake Sullivan had settled into the rhythm of ranch work with the ease of someone born to it, but his presence had created ripples that Samuel Morrison was beginning to notice. The first incident happened on a warm April morning. Eliza was hanging laundry behind the servants' quarters, her movements slow and careful as her pregnancy advanced into its 7th month. The green work dress that had become her uniform clung uncomfortably to her swollen form, and the simple task of reaching up to pin sheets to the line left her breathless. Jake appeared around the corner of the building, returning from the morning cattle check. He was shirtless, as had become his habit in the warming weather, his muscled torso gleaming with a light sheen of honest sweat. But his attention wasn't on his own comfort, it was on Eliza's obvious struggle. "Here, let me get those high ones," he said, taking the wet sheets from her hands before she could protest. "You don't need to," Eliza began, but Jake was already hanging the laundry with efficient movements. "My mama always said a gentleman doesn't watch a lady struggle when he could help," Jake replied, flashing her a grin that made something flutter in Eliza's chest that had nothing to do with the baby. "Besides, you're doing me a favor. Maria packed extra biscuits in my lunch today, and I can't eat them all myself." Before Eliza could object, Jake had produced a cloth bundle from his saddlebags. Inside were not just biscuits, but a thick slice of ham, fresh butter, and an apple that still had dew on its skin, the kind of food Eliza remembered from her days as Samuel's daughter, not the thin gruel and stale bread she'd grown accustomed to. "I couldn't," Eliza whispered, though her mouth was already watering. "Course you could. Baby needs proper food to grow strong." Jake's voice was matter-of-fact, as if sharing his lunch with the disgraced daughter of his employer was the most natural thing in the world. They sat in the shade of an old oak tree, and for 20 precious minutes, Eliza forgot about shame and status and her father's rage. Jake talked about his travels, about the different ranches he'd worked, about a particularly stubborn Mustang he'd gentled in Colorado. He asked her opinion on things, the best way to approach a spooked horse, whether the spring rains would be good for the grass, as if her thoughts mattered. It was the first real conversation Eliza had enjoyed in almost a year. But Samuel Morrison saw everything that happened on his ranch, And Jake's kindness to his daughter did not go unnoticed. The confrontation came 3 days later. Samuel cornered Jake near the horse corral, where the younger man was working with a green colt. The stallion was magnificent under Jake's patient hands, responding to his calm commands with growing trust. "Sullivan," Samuel's voice cut through the morning air like a blade. Jake straightened but didn't release the horse's lead rope. "Mr. Morrison, I pay you to work my cattle and train my horses, not to socialize with the hired help." There was no question about whom Samuel meant. Jake's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but his voice remained level. "I help where help's needed, sir. Always have." "That woman," Samuel's voice dripped with disgust, "is not your concern. She made her choices, and now she lives with the consequences. I won't have my ranch hands thinking they can ignore the order I've established here." Jake turned to face his employer fully, and for a moment, the two men sized each other up. Samuel Morrison was used to intimidating people. His wealth and power in Dust Rock County were legendary. But Jake Sullivan had faced down angry bulls and wild mustangs. He wasn't easily cowed. "Seems to me," Jake said carefully, "that showing basic Christian kindness to a pregnant woman isn't the same as disrupting order." Samuel's face flushed red. "Don't lecture me about Christian kindness, boy. That woman brought shame on this family. She'll live with that shame until she learns her lesson." "And what lesson would that be, exactly?" Jake's voice remained calm, but there was steel underneath. "That making a mistake means you deserve to be treated worse than livestock?" The silence that followed was dangerous. Samuel Morrison was not accustomed to being challenged, especially not by a hired hand. But Jake didn't back down, didn't drop his eyes or apologize. He simply stood there, holding the colt's lead rope, waiting. "You're new here, Sullivan, so I'll explain this once," Samuel finally said, his voice low and threatening. "That woman is my business and mine alone. You keep your distance, or you'll find yourself looking for work elsewhere. There are plenty of men who'd take your job without asking questions about my family affairs." Jake nodded slowly. "I understand your position, Mr. Morrison." But understanding wasn't the same as agreeing, and both men knew it. That afternoon, Jake sought out Eliza in the vegetable garden where she was weeding between the rows of early spring onions. She looked up when his shadow fell across her work, and Jake saw something in her expression that made his chest tighten. Fear, but not of him. Fear for him. "You spoke with my father," she said. "It wasn't a question." "I did. He told you to stay away from me." Again, not a question. Eliza had lived with Samuel Morrison's methods long enough to predict them. Jake knelt beside her in the garden dirt, his presence solid and reassuring. "He told me a lot of things. Doesn't mean I have to listen to all of them." Eliza's hands stilled on the weeds. "Jake, you don't understand. He'll ruin you. He has power in this county. He can make sure you never work anywhere again." "Maybe." Jake's voice was thoughtful. "But I've been poor before. I've been without work before. What I haven't been is the kind of man who walks away when someone needs a friend." The word hung in the air between them. Friend. It was such a simple concept, but revolutionary in Eliza's current world. "I'm not worth the risk," she whispered. Jake's calloused hand covered hers, stilling her nervous movement. "That's where you're wrong, Eliza Morrison. And maybe it's time someone reminded you of that." That evening, as Eliza lay on her narrow cot in the servants' quarters, she felt something she hadn't experienced in months: hope. It was small and fragile, like a candle flame in a strong wind, but it was there. What she didn't know was that Samuel Morrison was also lying awake, plotting how to rid himself of the ranch hand who dared to treat his disgraced daughter like a human being. The battle lines were drawn, and the stakes were higher than Jake Sullivan could possibly imagine. In Samuel Morrison's world, defiance came with a price, and he was prepared to collect it in full. The town of Dust Rock buzzed with whispers like a disturbed beehive. By May, everyone knew that Jake Sullivan, the new ranch hand at the Morrison spread, was taking up with Samuel Morrison's disgraced daughter. The stories grew more scandalous with each retelling. He was surely the father of her child, they said, Or perhaps he was taking advantage of her desperation for companionship. None of it was true, but truth had never stopped small-town gossip. Jake and Eliza's friendship had deepened through stolen moments of conversation and shared meals. He brought her books from the main house when Samuel wasn't looking, remembering how she'd mentioned loving to read. She helped him understand the complex relationships between the ranch hands and the best ways to approach Samuel when he needed supplies or equipment changes. Their connection was built on mutual respect and genuine caring, something rare and precious in both their lives. But to the outside world, it looked like scandal built upon scandal. The crisis came on a sweltering Saturday in late May. Eliza was 8 months pregnant now, her movements labored and her feet constantly swollen. She'd been scrubbing the main house floors since dawn, a task that required her to work on hands and knees for hours. By afternoon, she was exhausted and dizzy, pausing frequently to catch her breath. Jake found her collapsed in the hallway, unconscious from heat and exhaustion. He didn't hesitate. Scooping Eliza into his arms, he carried her to the shade of the front porch, calling for water and cool cloths. His shirt was off, as usual when working in the heat, and his muscled arms cradled Eliza's unconscious form with infinite gentleness. That's how Samuel Morrison found them when he returned from town with a group of prominent ranchers and their wives, his half-naked ranch hand holding his pregnant daughter in what looked like an intimate embrace. The explosion was immediate and volcanic. "Get your hands off her." Samuel's roar brought every person within 100 yards running. "How dare you touch my daughter?" Jake didn't move, didn't release Eliza until she stirred back to consciousness. Only then did he help her sit up, his movements careful and protective. "She collapsed from the heat, Mr. Morrison. She needs rest and proper food, not. Don't tell me what my daughter needs." Samuel's face was purple with rage. "I know exactly what she needs, and it's not the attention of every drifter who rides onto my property." Mrs. Caldwell, the mayor's wife, whispered something behind her fan to Mrs. Henderson from the bank. Their scandalized expressions made it clear what they thought they were witnessing. Eliza struggled to her feet, Jake's steady hand at her elbow. "Papa, he was only helping." "Shut your mouth." Samuel's hand raised as if to strike her, and Jake moved instantly, placing himself between father and daughter. "That's enough." Jake's voice was quiet, but it carried the kind of authority that made everyone freeze. "She's done nothing wrong." The silence stretched like a wire about to snap. Samuel Morrison stared at the ranch hand who dared to protect his daughter from his own hand, while their audience watched with horrified fascination. "Get off my property," Samuel said finally, his voice deadly quiet. "Pack your gear and get out. Now." Jake nodded calmly. "I'll need to collect my wages first." "You'll get nothing from me. Consider it payment for the liberties you've taken with my daughter." That's when Jake Sullivan showed exactly what kind of man he was. "I've taken no liberties with Miss Morrison," he said, his voice carrying clearly to every person present. "I've treated her with the respect and kindness that every person deserves, especially a woman carrying a child. If that offends you, Mr. Morrison, then the problem isn't with my behavior, it's with yours." The gasps from the watching crowd were audible. No one challenged Samuel Morrison publicly, certainly not a hired hand with nothing but the clothes on his back. But Jake wasn't finished. "You want to know what's shameful?" Jake continued, his eyes never leaving Samuel's face. "It's watching a father treat his daughter worse than he'd treat a stray dog. It's seeing a pregnant woman work herself to exhaustion while you worry more about your reputation than her health. It's letting a whole town pretend that cruelty is acceptable as long as it's dressed up as righteousness." Samuel's hand went to the gun at his hip, but Jake didn't flinch. "And you know what the real tragedy is?" Jake's voice softened, becoming almost conversational. "This woman, your daughter, has more strength, intelligence, and genuine goodness than anyone else in this county. But you're all too busy judging her for one mistake to see what you're throwing away." He turned to Eliza then, whose face was streaked with tears. "You're worth more than this, Eliza Morrison. Don't let anyone, not your father, not this town, not anyone, convince you otherwise." Jake began walking toward the bunkhouse to collect his belongings, but Eliza's voice stopped him. Wait. Her voice was shaky but growing stronger with each word. Jake, wait. She turned to face her father and the assembled crowd, her chin lifting with something that looked remarkably like the pride she'd once worn like a crown. He's right, she said, and her voice carried across the yard like a bell. I made a mistake. I trusted the wrong man and I got pregnant. But I won't apologize for being treated like a human being by someone who sees my worth. She moved to stand beside Jake, her hand finding his arm. If he goes, I go with him. The ultimatum hung in the air like smoke from a gun barrel. Samuel Morrison faced a choice: bend or lose his daughter forever. What he chose would determine not just Eliza's future, but whether love and human decency could triumph over pride and social convention in the harsh world of the frontier. The town held its breath, waiting to see whether redemption was possible, or if some sins could never be forgiven. The silence stretched across the Morrison ranch yard like a held breath. Samuel Morrison stood frozen, his hands still resting on his gun, staring at his daughter as if seeing her for the first time in months. Eliza held her ground beside Jake, her swollen belly prominent beneath the faded green dress, her chin raised with hard-won dignity. The assembled crowd of ranchers and their wives waited for the explosion they were sure would come. Samuel Morrison's rage was legendary, and no one, certainly not his disgraced daughter, challenged him publicly without consequences. But something unexpected flickered across Samuel's weathered face. Perhaps it was the way Eliza stood, no longer cowering but meeting his gaze with steady eyes. Perhaps it was the realization that Jake Sullivan's words had carried truth that cut deeper than any insult. Or perhaps it was simply the recognition that his daughter, despite everything, was still his blood. You'd leave with him? Samuel's voice was hoarse, barely above a whisper. If that's what it takes to be treated with basic human dignity, yes. Eliza's voice didn't waver, though Jake could feel her trembling. I won't live like an animal in your backyard anymore, Papa. I won't let my child grow up thinking they're worthless because of the circumstances of their birth. Mrs. Caldwell whispered something sharp to her companion, but Samuel raised his hand for silence. His eyes moved between his daughter and the ranch hand who stood protectively beside her, taking in Jake's respectful posture, his obvious care for Eliza, the way he made no move to claim credit for her courage while still offering his silent support. And you, Samuel addressed Jake directly, you'd take on a pregnant woman with nothing but trouble to offer? Risk your reputation, your future? Jake's answer came without hesitation. Mr. Morrison, with respect, your daughter isn't trouble. She's the strongest, most intelligent woman I've ever met. Any man would be honored to stand beside her. The words hit Eliza like a physical force. No one had ever spoken of her that way, not even before her fall from grace. In Jake's voice, she heard something she'd forgotten existed: unconditional respect and genuine admiration. Samuel was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke again, his voice held a weariness that seemed to age him before their eyes. Eliza. The name came out rough, as if he'd forgotten how to say it without anger. You're my daughter. My only child. I know, Papa. I was trying to teach you. To make you understand the consequences of your choices. Eliza's hand moved instinctively to her belly. I've lived with the consequences every day for 8 months. But consequences and cruelty aren't the same thing. The truth of it hung in the air, undeniable. Samuel Morrison, the man who'd built an empire through strength and determination, faced the realization that he'd nearly destroyed the most precious thing he possessed. If you stayed. Samuel's voice was uncertain, a tone no one had ever heard from him before. Things would have to change. They would, Eliza agreed quietly. Samuel looked at Jake again, seeing not a threat to his authority but a man who'd done what he himself had failed to do: protect and value his daughter when she needed it most. Sullivan, your wages. You'll get what you're owed, plus extra for. Samuel struggled with the words. For your kindness to my daughter. Jake nodded respectfully. Thank you, sir. But I wasn't doing it for payment. I know. Samuel's voice was quiet. That's what makes it worth something. What happened next surprised everyone, including Eliza herself. Samuel Morrison walked across the yard to his daughter, stopped just in front of her, and did something he hadn't done since she was a child. He looked at her with pride. "You've got strength, girl. More than I gave you credit for." His voice was rough with emotion. "Can you forgive a stubborn old man who forgot that punishment and love aren't the same thing?" Eliza's tears came then, but they were clean tears, washing away months of shame and isolation. "Oh, Papa." The embrace was tentative at first, then fierce. Samuel held his daughter for the first time since her disgrace, feeling the movement of his grandchild beneath her dress, understanding finally what he'd almost lost. The birth came 2 weeks later. Jake paced the front porch of the main house where Eliza had been moved back to her old room, while the midwife attended to the delivery. Samuel sat beside him, the two men united in their concern for the woman they both cared about. When the baby's cry finally pierced the night air, both men jumped to their feet. "It's a girl," Maria called from the doorway. "Healthy and strong, just like her mama." Jake was the first to see Eliza holding her daughter, both of them cleaned and resting in the big four-poster bed that had once been Eliza's as Samuel's pampered daughter. But the woman who smiled at him from the pillows was someone new, not the sheltered girl she'd been, nor the broken woman she'd become, but someone stronger and more beautiful than either. "What will you name her?" Jake asked softly. "Hope," Eliza said without hesitation. "Her name is Hope." 6 months later, as autumn painted the Texas hills in gold and red, Jake Sullivan and Eliza Morrison were married in the Dust Rock Church. Eliza wore a new green dress, not silk this time, but sturdy cotton that would serve a ranch wife well. Jake stood beside her in his best shirt, his work-hardened hands gentle as he slipped a simple gold band onto her finger. Samuel Morrison walked his daughter down the aisle, his head high with genuine pride. The town watched, some still whispering, but many nodding in approval at the happiness that radiated from the unlikely couple. As Jake and Eliza spoke their vows, baby Hope gurgled contentedly in Maria's arms, surrounded by love and acceptance she would never have to earn. The disgraced daughter had found redemption, but not in the way anyone expected. She'd found it not by erasing her past or hiding from her mistakes, but by refusing to let shame define her worth. With Jake's love as her foundation and her own hard-won strength as her guide, Eliza Morrison Sullivan had become exactly who she was meant to be. And in the process, she taught her father, her husband, and her community that sometimes the greatest courage comes not from avoiding mistakes, but from rising above them with grace, dignity, and an unshakable belief in the possibility of new beginnings. As the couple rode away from the church toward their future together, the green dress that had once symbolized punishment now fluttered in the wind like a banner of triumph, proof that redemption belongs to anyone brave enough to claim it.